Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the 2023 McCain Conference. Our theme this year, Moral Character Development and Assessment. I'm Jeff McCrease. I'm one of the deputy directors of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership here at the Naval Academy. And it's a great pleasure to welcome back to Annapolis Mr. David Brooks, a political and cultural commentator for the New York Times. Mr. Brooks has had a varied and very distinguished career. Graduate of the University of Chicago. He's worked as a reporter and later an op-ed editor for the Wall Street Journal, senior editor for the Weekly Standard, a contributing editor at Newsweek and The Atlantic, in addition to serving as a regular commentator for NPR and the PBS NewsHour. Mr. Brooks writes frequently about ethics and moral development and is the author of the 2015 book, The Road to Character. So once again, Mr. David Brooks.
Pleasure to be back here at the Academy, and a pleasure to follow General Mattis. A little intimidating pleasure to follow him. He had made a reference. My wife and I had dinner with him about 4 or 5 years ago, and he asked us about how we got married. And I happened to mention to him, and he made a quick reference to it just there, that my wife managed to dump me 18 times before she agreed to marry me. And so there were long times where I couldn't talk to her. We were like not talking. And she was living in Texas. But I couldn't communicate with her, but I did have a column in the New York Times. And so I wrote a column called A Love Story about a couple who comes together, trying to think that'll win her over. And then when things were going badly, I would write about the Middle East. A terrible situation. So anyway, that's what he was referring to. So it's a pleasure to be back here, a pleasure to be back at the McCain event. John McCain was the politician I enjoyed covering the most and got to know him pretty well. He was a guy who was, in blue, honor-driven. One of the most honor-driven people I've ever met. And when you can't, covering a campaign, the guy is traveling, you're in a van with him for 12 or 15 hours a day while he's doing events and you're just covering him. And if you want to get John McCain talking, you would mention something at 6 in the morning that he found dishonorable. And so you would say, "Do you see what Rick Santorum said today?" And he'd go, "That effing asshole." And then he was off. We had 12 hours of good conversation ahead of us. And just to show the difference between military guys and me, I once went with John McCain and his prisoner of war buddy, a guy named Bud Day, won the Medal of Honor. And we all went down to New Orleans where they were filming a movie of about the Hanoi Hilton. And we visit the set, and McCain and Bud Day visit a set that looks exactly like the Hanoi Hilton. And there are a bunch of actors who are Vietnamese guys in prison uniform guards. And they're surrounding them, and like, McCain and Day are just, this is weird, to be back in what looked exactly like where they were kept for 5 years. And then in New Orleans, we go to this beautiful restaurant called Antoine's, and we have a meal which is probably 30,000 calories, and we have a number of drinks in the high 2 digits. And at the end of the meal, they give you a coffee with brandy in it that they've set on fire. And they pour it on the table, and you get this blue flame, and they stick it in your cup, and the blue flame is sticking up. And I turn to the waiter and say, "Is it decaf?" Like, this is really what matters at this moment. So, but McCain just a true. He was down in the polls, and I looked at his campaign step manager, and I said, "There's really only one great man in this race," and he ended up winning that nomination in 2008. So you may wonder why I'm here. I haven't served in the military. I haven't captained a ship, flown an aircraft. My background is somewhat more prosaic and maybe less impressive. When I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. And I've pretty much written every day since. I probably missed 200 days in the course of the last 50 years where I haven't written. In high school, I wanted to date a woman named Bernice. She didn't want to date me. She dated some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so that was my values. And so I stayed kind of intellectual. When I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And the famous saying about Chicago, it's where fun goes to die. It's like Johns Hopkins on steroids, basically, or Johns, whatever the school is next door. And my favorite saying about Chicago, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. So super intellectual. And then I went into journalism. I worked for the Wall Street Journal. I covered the end of the Soviet Union. I covered the Middle East, South Africa. Then I got a job being a conservative columnist at the New York Times, a job I likened to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there. And then I got a job on PBS on TV for the NewsHour, a job I treasure. I'll talk a little about that as a morally formative institution. Our audience, some of you young people may not know it, our audience is somewhat seasoned. So if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. They're very big in the hospice community. And so then I started writing books on moral formation and character. And I learned over the course of the 3 or 4 books on the subject I've written that writing a book on character doesn't give you good character. And even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. So I recommend that. And so I'm going to talk a little about what I've learned about character formation over the last decade or a decade and a half. And I've sort of had a progression of different models. And the first model I think of as the Victorian model, that we've got all these desires, these passions, and character formation is developing the willpower to repress your desires. And that's one model. I sort of think it doesn't work. If it did, we'd all follow through our New Year's resolutions. But that's one model. The second model is what I wrote about in The Road to Character, which I'll call the Eisenhower model. And that's the ability to confront your weaknesses. Eisenhower understood that his greatest flaw and his greatest sin was anger. And so over the course of his service in the military and presidency, he identified anger as his weakness. I'm not going to tolerate that. And so he would do exercises like he would, at the middle of the night, he'd write down the names of all the people he hated and angry was at, and he'd rip up the paper in a fit of rage and throw it in the garbage can. And he made himself into a cheerful, optimistic guy because he knew he couldn't lead from a position of pessimism and anger. And so I think that's also part of moral formation character. The third is what I'll call the Augustinian, after St. Augustine. And that's to elevate your desires. You can't replace a bad desire. You can't repress a bad desire. You can only replace it with a better desire. And so Augustine has this concept of ordered loves. We all desire a lot of things, but some of those desires are higher than others. So if you tell me a secret and I rat it out on a dinner party, I've put my love of popularity above my love of friendship, and that's sin. And so getting your desires in the right order. And the reason many of you serve is because of love of country. The love of your country enables you because you have this high desire to go through all the stuff you have to go through here. If we have a kid, you want to screw around on the weekend and lay down, but your kid wants to go play. So you don't play golf, you go play with your kid because you love your kid so much. And it's that love of your kid that elevates you as a person and makes you less self-interested. And then the fourth model is more concrete, and that's what I think about these days. And it's about social skills. It's about the skill, the specific skill of being a considerate human being in the concrete activities of life. As Midshipman and Booker said, these are great words, but a lot of them are kind of abstract. And so I think about the concreteness. And I have a new moral philosopher that I listen to named Ted Lasso. And Lasso has a statement in the first series, I think, first season. He's being interviewed by that guy from The Independent. And he asks him, what's your goals for the season? And Ted Lasso says, For me, success is not about wins and losses. It's about helping these young fellows be the best versions of themselves on and off the field. And normally in leadership, you would think, what's your goal? My goal is to win a championship. My goal is to win victories. But Lasso is saying, no, my goal is to make the men I'm working with the best versions of themselves they can be on and off the field. So that got me thinking about moral leadership and what it is. It seems important these days. We're surrounded, as you know, by an epidemic of loneliness, depression, suicide, hatred, bigotry. Some of us were talking about maybe you've seen the Wall Street Journal survey this week. Only 23% of young adults say they put a high value on patriotism. Only 23% put a high value on having kids. Only 31% put a high value on religion and community. And so there's just a lot of disillusionment out there. So what can we say about moral leaders in the Ted Lasso mold? First, moral leaders that understand that moral formation is part of the job. Your job is not just your objective, the material objective. Your job is to make the people around you better. Now, moral formation is a big fancy phrase, but it really means three things. One, it's about helping people learn to restrain their selfishness. Two, it's about helping people find a purpose in life so they have a true north which they can direct their life to. And three, it's about teaching people to treat each other with kindness and consideration in these concrete circumstances of life. How do you tell someone an unpleasant truth? How do you disagree well? How do you sit with someone who's suffering? How do you criticize someone without causing them undue pain? How do you dump someone without breaking their heart? These are just concrete skills, the way you would learn to row or to sail. They're social and emotional skills. Second thing I think we could say about moral leaders is they see the world through a moral lens. What does that mean? We all put on different lenses at different times. So there was an Israeli daycare center that had a problem. The parents were coming in late to pick up their kids, and the teachers couldn't go home on time. So the daycare center decided we're going to crack down on this. We're going to impose a fine. Any parent who comes in late, got to pay a fine. The number of parents who came late doubled. Why was that? It's because before, come in and pick up your kid on time was they saw it through a moral lens. I've got to be kind to the teachers. But when they imposed a fine, they saw it through a transactional lens, a financial lens. I'll pay some money, but I'll pick up the kid late. And once they saw it through a transactional lens, they were happy to pay the fine. There's a story about a hospital janitor named Luke who cleans rooms, and he cleans a room in one ward, and one of the rooms has a kid in it who was in a fight, got in a coma that he's not coming out of. And his dad sits there in the room every day, and Luke cleans the room every day. One day when Luke cleaned the room, the dad was out getting a smoke. And the dad came up to Luke later in the day and said, "You didn't clean my kid's room today." Now, Luke could have seen his job through a transactional lens. My job is to clean rooms. In which case he would have said, "Yeah, I did clean the room, you were just out." But he saw his job through a moral lens. And so he went, my job is to comfort patients and their families. So we went back and he cleaned the room a second time just so the dad could see him cleaning it. And that's a different lens. In my job, we have a moral lens. We want to tell the truth. We have a transactional lens. We want to get page views to make money. And these lenses are always both there. And so we have this internal contradiction between one lens and the other. And sometimes it's just hard to forget the moral lens. So moral leaders always keep their eye on the moral lens. Next, moral leaders create moral ecologies. What do I mean by a moral ecology? Well, let me tell you a story that's based on the NewsHour. So there's a PBS show that's a news program on every night. And my first 10 years there, my boss was a guy named Jim Lehrer, the host of the show. And when I said something good that he liked on set, on the air, his eyes would crinkle in pleasure. And when I said something bad and crass and stupid, his mouth would turn down in displeasure. And so for 10 years, I tried to get the eye crinkles and avoid the mouth downturn. He never had to say anything to me about how to do my job. But he trained me just with these small gestures And he not only trained me, he trained everyone around. And so the NewsHour, Jim's been dead for a number of years now, the NewsHour still has that moral ecology. This is how we do things here. And I go through organizations, some schools leave a mark on you and some don't. Some companies leave a mark on you, some don't. This institution, you meet a Marine, you know he's a Marine or he or she is a Marine right away, because the Marine Corps is such a thick moral ecology. Morehouse College. I have a friend who runs a little magazine, his name is Yuval, and I ran into one of his young interns, and she said, every time I want to send a tweet, I stop because I have a picture of Yuval's disappointed face in my head. That guy set a moral ecology. And so it's the small manners is how we do things here. And you can tell you've set a moral ecology because when people leave your organization, they want to recreate it in the next organization they get to, because they value that kind of culture. So how do you set a moral ecology? Well, the answer is people are watching you more closely than you think they are. I wrote a column many years ago about how hard it is to teach morality in the classroom. And I got an email from a veterinarian named Dave Jolly in Oregon who wrote to me, what a wise person teaches is the smallest part of what they live, what they give. The totality of their life, the way they go about it in the smallest detail is what gets transmitted. Never forget that. The message is the person. And that really struck home. The message is the person. He wrote to me about the time when Pope Francis became Pope. And the whole world was in love with Francis. And a lot of them were not Catholics. There was something about that guy they liked. The message was the person. I went to the University of Chicago. My professors loved the great books and thought if you study these books in the right way, you will know how to live a life. And I don't remember what they taught me a lot, but I remember how they were, and I remember that devotion. There's a saying, if you catch fire with enthusiasm, people will come for miles to watch you burn. And they had that fire. And they taught me new things to love. I loved these books and the kind of conversation and the kind of formation. So the presence we emit is often more important than the role we perform. And so it's about these small things. And if you can do that, engender the kind of respect that, say, Jim Lehrer did, you have tapped into the strongest motivational force known to humankind. If you pay me, yeah, I'll work for you. But if I respect you and I want you to admire me, I'll bust my ass. It's how you get people to really work the hardest. And these things get transmitted from generation to generation. There was a baseball player named Ryne Sandberg who played for the Chicago Cubs in the 1990s, 1980s. He was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 2005. And he gave a speech which to me shows what a moral ecology looks like, what moral formation looks like and how it's passed down from one generation to another. In 25, he said, I was in awe every time I walked onto the field. That's respect. I was taught you never ever disrespected your opponent or your teammates, your organization or your manager, never ever your uniform. Make a great play, act like you've done it before. Get a big hit, look for the third base coach and get ready to run the bases. Sandberg referred to the old Hall of Fame guys who were already sitting up on stage. He said, these guys sitting here did not pave the way for the rest of us so that players could swing for the fences every time up and forget how to move a runner over to third. It's disrespectful to them, to you, and to the game of baseball we all played growing up. They did what they were supposed to do, and I did what I was supposed to do. And when he's like respecting the uniform, respecting those who came before, and as a result, he knows, this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm just going to do what I'm supposed to do. And that moral ecology has communicated that truth. And here's where it gets gushy. Because in the military sense particularly, you can talk about courage in combat. But, you know, I teach 7 or 8 young men and women who are military every year in my college classes, though they are mid-career military. And so when I think of really the essence of morality for most people at most times in life, it's not the big epic heroic action. It's being a genius at the close of at hand. in the normal situations of life. I've become a fan. I was talking just now with the philosopher Iris Murdoch, who said, morality is what happens. It goes on continuously through the seemingly everyday actions of everyday life. It's the skill of being considerate towards others in the complex situations of life, welcoming a newcomer to the workplace, detecting anxiety in somebody's voice and asking what's wrong, knowing how to host a party so everybody feels included. They don't give out medals for this, but it's these everyday activities that for most of us is the essence of morality. And Murdoch said the core of it, the core act, the first act before anything else can happen, is to cast a just and loving attention on people, to attend to you in the right way. When we meet somebody, we're all asking certain questions. Am I a priority to you? Do you care about me? Do you see me? Will you try to understand me? And you communicate that first with your gaze before anything else. In this world, there are illuminators and diminishers. Diminishers stereotype. They ignore. They're egotistical. They're all about themselves. They're not really seeing you. They're not casting a just and loving attention on you. Illuminators, on the other hand, make you feel seen, heard, and understood. There was a novelist named E.M. Forster about 100 years ago. His biographer wrote of him, to speak to him was to be seduced by an inverse charisma, a sense of being listened to with such intensity you had to be your best, most honest, and sharpest self. How good would it be to be that guy? There was a woman named Jenny Jerome who later became Winston Churchill's mother. But in the 19th century, she was at a dinner party in England, and she was seated next to William Gladstone, the great British statesman. And she left that dinner thinking that Gladstone was the most clever person in England. Then a couple weeks later, she was at a dinner with Gladstone's great rival, Benjamin Disraeli. And she left that dinner thinking that she was the most clever person in England. So it's good to be Gladstone. It's better to be Disraeli. There's a Bell Labs, was a very famous scientific laboratory years ago. And some of their researchers were really productive, very creative and innovative, and some were not. And they wanted to know why are some researchers productive and others not. And they looked through their educational background, IQ, they couldn't find anything. And then they discovered accidentally that the most productive and creative researchers happened to have frequent lunches and breakfasts with a guy named Harry Nyquist, who was an engineer. And Nyquist listened to them talk about their problems and asked the right questions and got inside their head. And he made them productive because he was an illuminator. So you tell people who you are by how you pay attention to them. I was at a diner doing some reporting in Waco, Texas, and I was interviewing a 93-year-old lady named LaRue Dorsey. And she was tough. She was like a drill sergeant to me. She had been a teacher. She said, I loved my students enough to discipline them. And I was a little intimidated by her. And a mutual friend of ours named Jimmy Durrell, who's a pastor down there, comes into the diner and he sees us and he walks over to Mrs. Dorsey and he shakes her way harder than you should shake a 93-year-old. And he says, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best, I love you, I love you. And that drill sergeant that had been talking to me suddenly turns into a bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl. And she just beamed and lit up. And so the lesson is gaze at people more like Jimmy Durrell than like me. And it's not because he's more garrulous. And it's not because he has known her longer, so of course he can do that with her and she's going to be more comfortable with him. It's because he's a pastor. And you can be a Christian, Jew, atheist, whatever, I don't care. But there's something about his gaze that's important. When he looks at a person, he greets each person as if they're made in the image of God. When he looks into each person he meets, every one, he feels like he's looking into the face of God. He's looking in each person at a soul, that there's some piece of each person that has no size, shape, color, or weight, but gives them infinite value and dignity. And in his theology, he's meeting someone so important that Jesus was willing to die for that person. Now, as I say, you don't have to believe in God or not believe in God. I don't care, not my department. But if you treat everybody with that level of respect, then you have achieved the first part of moral leadership. you've done the gaze. Then, after you do that gaze, do that meeting, the main body of interacting with people is having conversations. That's mostly what we do. And so how good are you as a conversationalist? Well, I don't know you personally, but I've read the research, and I can tell you you're not as good as you think you are. It's very easy to have a non-memorable conversation and to not make people feel seen, heard, and understood, and not to really get them. If you want to succeed as an officer, it seems like it's kind of important to understand the people around you, to know what's going on in their heads. And, they do research on this. If I just look at you and make guesses about what's going on in your head, you're going to be right about 22% of the time. And some of you are going to be right 0% of the time. And you're going to think you're right 100% of the time. You can't guess. You have to ask. You have to have quality conversations. So I've asked a bunch of conversation experts, give me some tips on how to be a better conversationalist. And I'll share a couple of them. And again, I want to emphasize, these are just practical skills, practical social skills, but to me are part of moral leadership. Some of these tips. 1, treat attention as an on-off switch, not a dimmer. If you're in conversation with somebody, 100% attention or 0% attention, not 60%. 2, be a loud listener. I have a buddy, when I talk to him, he's like one of these congregants at a super charismatic Pentecostal church. He's going like, yes, 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 preach, preach. I love talking to that guy. He's a loud listener. 3, make them authors, not witnesses. When people tell you about events, they don't go into enough detail. If you say, well, where was your boss standing when he said that to you? Then suddenly they're narrating it as a story. People talk better when they're telling stories. As a journalist, I don't ask people anymore, what do you believe? I ask, how did you come to believe that? Because then they have to tell me a story of how they came to believe that. And stories are just more informative than statements. Don't fear the pause. I got this from a guy in improv. So if I'm talking to you, my comment starts at my shoulder and it goes off to my fingertips. And I'm talking. At what point have you stopped listening so you can think of what you're going to say next? Probably about here. Let me talk to my fingertips and then pause and reflect. You'll hear everything that I'm saying. Keep the gem statement at the center. When we disagree, there's likely a possibility that there's some core belief that we actually agree upon. So if my brother and I are fighting about our health care for our dad, we both agree that we want the best outcomes for our dad. So if we're having a fight and we return to the gem statement, what we agree on, then we'll keep the relationship intact amid disagreement. Then finally, ask big questions. The quality of your conversations depends on the quality of your questions. Now, you're all former expert questioners because kids are great at question asking. I have a friend named Naomi Way. He teaches 8th grade boys in New York. And she wanted to teach them how to be interviewers so they could become journalists. So she said to the first day of class, 8th grade boys, I'm going to sit in front of the room. You ask me any question you want, and I'll answer it truthfully. So the first question from one boy was, are you married? No. Second question, are you divorced? Yes. Third question, do you still love him? She said, yes. Fourth question, does he know? Do your kids know? Tough questioners. So once you know somebody and you've earned their trust, you can ask the big questions. Enlarge the conversation with big questions. I was out at a dinner with an 80-year-old political scientist. He said, what should I do for the rest of my life? We had a phenomenal dinner. It was a big question, like what should old age look like? What's left on his agenda? And there are some questions that lift you out of your daily activities and look at yourself from 30,000 feet. And there are questions like, what crossroads are you at? Most of us are at some crossroads at most points of our life. I have a friend who was being interviewed for a job, but he turned around and asked the questioner, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And she started crying because she wouldn't be doing HR at that company if she wasn't afraid. I asked my students at Yale, what do you do if you weren't afraid? And every year I get a couple who say, I wouldn't be at Yale. It's not the right school for me. But I'm afraid to quit because of the prestige. If you died tonight, what would you regret not doing? If we met a year from now, what will we be celebrating? Can you be yourself where you are and still fit in? If the next 5 years of your life are a chapter, what's the chapter about? People often ask me, what should I do with my life? I said, it's too big a question. Just think about your 5 years. I learned that from a colonel in the Army. Every time he redeployed, or moved to a new base, he and his wife would do a 3-day retreat and just break their life down to the studs. Are we happy with the Army? Are we happy with the way our marriage? Are we happy with the way we're raising our kids? And I've learned that the happier people divide their life into chapters. And the ones who get old and have regrets never do that. So every day is just a succession of days. And they don't plan their life. It just sort of strings out. And so it's those quality of conversations. Conversation and attention is a moral act. And I'll just close with a story from a movie I hope you've all seen. And to me, you wouldn't think it's moral leadership, but to me it is. And the movie is called Good Will Hunting. And if you remember, Matt Damon plays a math genius in that movie. And he goes through the movie solving these incredible math problems, slaying pompous grad students with his wit. But because of something he did, he has to see a psychologist, played by Robin Williams. And they have a good relationship. They bond over the Red Sox. But then Matt Damon does what he does to people, which is lacerate them with his wit. And he makes fun of a painting Robin Williams made that meant a lot to him. And Williams goes home that night and is sort of emotionally destroyed. And then he realized, well, Will Hunting doesn't actually know me. And so he takes Will Hunting the next day out to a pond, if you remember the scene, and he gives him a little speech. And here's a bit of the speech. He says to him, you're a tough kid. I ask you about war, and you've probably throw Shakespeare at me, right? Once more into the breach, dear friends. But you've never been near one. You've never held your best friend's head in your lap and watched him gasp his last breath, looking to you for help. If I ask you about love, you probably quote me a sonnet. But you've never looked at a woman and been totally vulnerable, known someone who could level you with her eyes. I look at you, I don't see an intelligent, confident man. I see a cocky, scared, shitless kid. But you're a genius, Will, no one denies that. Personally, I don't care about all that, because you know what? I can't learn anything from you that I can't read in some book. Unless you want to talk about that, who you are, then I'd be fascinated. But you don't want to do that, sport. You're terrified of what you might say. Now, this speech is moral leadership on a couple of letters. One, the therapist has listened to Will Hunting so well, he's heard what Will Hunting is desperate to hide, which is that he's scared, that he's been fearful because of his orphan childhood. And he lays that ugly secret on the table and says, I care for you anyway. That's just a very skillful act. Second, it's critiquing with care. He's saying to Will, and this is true of all of us, there are two kinds of knowledge. There's the kind of knowledge that's all up here that we communicate in classrooms and in books, and it's important knowledge. It's what I do for a living. But there's the kind of knowledge you get from experiences, from being vulnerable, from having it's a kind of emotional and spiritual and moral knowledge. And he's saying, you're really good at one kind of knowledge, the head knowledge, and you use it as a defensive shield. But if you're going to have a real life, you have to have this other kind of personal knowledge. You have to unbuckle. You have to be vulnerable. And so he points toward a different way of being. If you remember the end of the movie, Will goes off and with his girlfriend, willing to be vulnerable with another human being. And so the kind of morality I've talked about here is gushy. It's every day. You don't get it by working out. I'm happy to say that in this room. But it's everyday morality. And in my view, it's how you'll lead and it's how you'll be remembered. Thank you.
got 10 minutes.
So we have 10 minutes for questions. All I ask that you make them long and rambling with no question at the end. We
Hi, sir. I'm Colin H. I'm the senior Army rep at NGA. First, I got to comment on Ryan Sandberg because I played baseball at Army and I'm currently an NCAA umpire. But you made me a little bit sad because I thought about what he said. And the players today, they do swing for the fences.
Absolutely.
And they do that because analytics tells them to.
Yeah.
And where's Cadet Watson? Raise your hand. Okay. At the break, Cadet Watson was telling me that she studied sabermetrics at West Point. So if you have questions on this, here's your expert. But the serious question I wanted to ask you, and I think you touched on it when you talked about the moral lens versus a transactional lens, and you cited the Wall Street Journal poll from last week, and I know you're familiar with the Gallup poll and the Quinnipiac poll about trust in public institutions. And your profession has dismal ratings. I think you're aware of that, probably painfully aware. And you talked about moral versus transactional. I think that kind of hits on it. But you guys are so important to a democracy, and we don't trust you. Not you personally, but your profession. And General Mattis hit on this too when he said watching the wrong stations. It seems to me that they pander to their audiences. They don't care about the truth. They don't care about journalistic standards. So how have we gone wrong, and how can we fix this?
Well, there are a couple things. What is trust? Trust is faith. Trust is an act of faith. Faith that you'll do the right thing. You'll do what you ought to do. I have faith that you'll do what you ought to do. That's what trust is. And it involves having a common set of values, a common set of practices and norms. If we're merging on the highway, one lane to the other, right lane, left lane, right lane, left lane. And if you butt in line, I'm going to honk my horn to try to enforce that trust. So why has the media lost trust? One, because we have not disciplined ourselves to stay in our lane and just tell the truth. Just tell the truth. That's all we're supposed to do. And so we now have people who don't tell the truth because it's just more popular. And if you're on TV, not on sainted PBS, but on other channels, they rate you every minute. Every minute there's a rating. So if a guest is not rating well, not coming back. If a subject is not rating well, not coming back. We have a terrible fentanyl problem in this country. We barely cover that. It doesn't rate well. So it's just the corruption of the marketplace, frankly. The second reason we have earned distrust is that I made that joke about being chief rabbi at Mecca. So when I hire an assistant, there's people at HR who take the vast pool of applicants and narrow it down to 3. And so the last pool of my final 3, the colleges that I went to were Stanford, Yale, and Yale. If you stood in the Washington, D.C. News Bureau and you swung an axe, you would hit 6 people who went to Harvard, which would be a good thing to do, by the way. But we have become a creature not only of elite colleges, but elite private high schools. And there are almost no conservatives at any of the news organizations I work at. And there are very few rural people. And if you tell half of America your voice is not worth hearing, they are not going to trust you. And we made that mistake 40 or 50 years ago and continue to make it. And so we separated ourselves off from a lot of the country. And so when I go out and I interview people, in 2015, I read 10 columns, "Don't worry, Donald Trump will never be the Republican nominee for president." I was working at the New York Times. My social life was in New York. I was teaching at Yale. How could I be out of touch with America? And so now I spend a lot of time traveling. I was in Missouri yesterday, and just to be in touch. And I have great conversations. I'm always terrified of that moment. They say, "Well, where do you work?" Then you enter a little bucket of trouble. But we did that to ourselves. Yes, sir.
So I'm Jackson Hathaway. I'm a senior midshipman here at the Academy. Kind of touching on the point of higher education, the Times this week. Can you hear me, sir? The Times this week ran a big piece about their interviews with college students and how many of them are extremely dissatisfied with their experience in higher education. How would you propose measures that could potentially make higher education more academically and spiritually valuable for Americans?
Well, one thing, what you guys have here, and what St. John's, I now remember the name, has across the street, is there really is moral formation. My students come to me, and I say, you're very good people, you're just morally inarticulate. No one's giving you the categories to think in. And they say, yes, that's true. And so they get out of school, and then 5 years later they had a failure, and they call me, and they're crushed. Their voice is different, they are crushed. And there's a phrase from Viktor Frankl. It's from Nietzsche, but Viktor Frankl quotes it. He who has a why to live for can endure any how. If you know why you're on this earth, when you have the setbacks, you can handle them. But if you don't have a why, the setbacks really are crushing. And so, in my view, one of the problems with higher ed is we don't do the kind of, we're going to turn out good students. There was a school called the Stowe School in Vermont where the headmaster said, our job here is to provide students who are acceptable at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck. And that was character formation. And we don't really do that anymore. And then the second thing I'll say, and this is something General Mattis, I'll quote from his book called Sign Chaos. He wrote in that book, if you haven't read hundreds and hundreds of books, you're functionally illiterate, because your own life is not diverse enough to understand what all the experiences you're going to encounter. So it's reading in the humanities, and I think the humanities, and this was actually not what the students were saying, some of them regretted majoring in the humanities, but the humanities to me and the liberal arts teach you about other people, and most of life is about dealing with other people. And so it's the most practical form of knowledge. And just once I want to have a student come up to me and say, you know, I really want to major in accounting, but my parents are forcing me to major in French poetry. The parental pressures go all the other way. Sir, I think right here, did you have a question? Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. I'm Midshipman First Class Sheldon here. So my question is more of a simpler one, right? And that is, right, if we're an illuminator in our life and we stumble upon someone who's like an extreme diminisher in that sense, right? Like, do you never give up? At what point do you let that be, or how do you go about that? Because there's been instances in my life, right, where I've stumbled across these people, and like as much as I try to live that illuminator life, like I love that concept you brought up. I try to live that life. There's not much I can do about it, and I've like hit roadblocks, so to say.
It's a very good question. I confess I've got a book coming out sort of on this subject in the fall called How to Know a Person, the Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. So I've been thinking about this for years, but I was with a guy yesterday who just talked about himself the whole time. And I couldn't get him to ask me a question. And sometimes I'll and I've learned in my life that about 30% of the people I meet are question askers. And the majority are not. They're just not question askers. And I have not found a way to get a non-questioner to ask questions. And so the diminishers in my life, they're narcissistic, which is impossible to cure, they're egocentric, which is a problem, or they're anxious. They've got so much going on in their head, they can't think about you. And I wish I could give you like how to turn a diminisher into an illuminator. In conversation, I haven't solved that problem, but they can buy my book. Maybe we have time. Thank you for the question. Maybe we have time for one more. Just back there.
Sir, Cadet back in West Point, class of 24. So, I found your brief biography of George C. Marshall to be quite illuminating in my life. But something that's confronting about it is we're often learning about these paragons of character people, especially later in their life. Like we hear about all the good stories. But I have to think that people like George C. Marshall faltered and midshipmen and cadets in the room about how those folks learn from their failures or learn from their shortcomings and things like that, sir?
Yeah, well, that book, Road to Character, was about people who were kind of pathetic at age 20 and kind of amazing at age 70. And so none of them started out impressive, and George C. Marshall did not. Very mediocre student. Not a great. He went to a military academy. Not so great there. It was only when he actually was in the Army that he found an institution that would mold him, and that he could utterly devote himself to the institution of it. I guess I would say the one thing that leaps immediately to mind is one of the reasons America is in trouble is we think of our institutions differently than people used to. And I never believe in going to the past. I don't want to go back to the past, but there are some things we can learn from the past. And it used to be our institutions formed us. You come to the Naval Academy, there are so many ways it forms you. And your job is just to live up to these standards. But in a lot of institutions in our society, we use them on stages on which we can perform. So people go to Congress not to pass legislation so they can get on TV. They use their company as a place I can shine. And so they never get formed. And so to me, the best thing I can say a lot of things to young people. I'll say a couple things. But find an institution to which you can submit and trust in the process of submitting when young. It's hard to think of, but you don't know. And the second thing I'll say is, and I say this to college students, it's not going to be true for people here because you have your immediate future set for you. But at some point in your life, you're going to leave the military. And at that life, you will confront a crisis. Because in the military, your rules are set, your paths are set, your friendships are set. And in college, no matter, even a non-military school, your life is station to station. Everyone's always assigning you something, or you're applying to something. When you get out of school or when you get out of the military, there are no more stations. You're just sailing on a big ocean with no landmarks. And I know many people who, when they hit that point, at whatever age, total identity crisis, loss of friendship, loss of identity, who the hell am I? And so one antidote to that, one way to prevent that crisis is to overinvest in your friendships here. Because you're really going to need them at that crisis. And so just one practical thing I'll end with. I have a buddy who's like 40, works in the intelligence business. His final day of college, he and 10 of his closest friends created a giving circle. They said, every year we're going to put money into a pot, and we'll get together 3 or 4 days a year, and we'll decide where to give the money. And they don't have a lot of money. They're public employees, but they give it away. And the giving away of the money is not the important thing. The important thing is that they have the same set of friends they meet with 3 days a year all through life. And so they have a set of lifelong friends. That's just so super important, because the friends you meet here, you will share something with. You will never make friendships like this again. And so I always tell my students, you are going to need your friends. Over-invest in your friendships. And so that's one thing that leaps randomly to mind. Thank you all very much.
Well, Mr. Brooks, on behalf of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, thank you very much. We appreciate your return to Annapolis. We'll take a 20-minute break, and we'll reconvene in here at 20 minutes past the hour. Thank you.